Welcome everybody here today. We have a wonderful crowd, and deservedly so. I am Professor Ronnie Perellis, the Alkali Chair of Svardic Studies at Yeshiva University, and the Director of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program in International Affairs. That is co-sponsoring this with our friends at the ASF. And if you've been tuning in every week, we've been learning about whole new worlds within the wider Sephardic diaspora, and this week is no exception, except that we have an exceptional speaker and scholar with us today. I'm going to read her short official bio because it gives you a sense of the breadth and depth. Jane S. Gerber is Professor Emerita of History and Director of the Institute for Sephardic Studies at the Graduate Center of the CUNY. She is past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. She has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Hebrew University, University of Pennsylvania, Jewish Theological Seminary, and has lectured widely in the United States and elsewhere. She headed the advisory board of the American Sephardi Federation and served on the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History and the Academic Board for the Rothberg School of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Just last week, we featured here Professor Stanley Mervis, who was a student of Jane's, and there are so many people out there in the world today teaching Jewish history, focusing on the Sephardim, that are doing that because of Professor Gerber's long history of hard work in this field, uncovering worlds, and teaching her students how to be historians, and how to think like historians and work like historians. And I want to just give a small testament to this. I use this. This is her textbook that I have used since I started teaching at Yeshiva University, and you can see the use that has gone into this and the tattered everything of it, because I use it at least once a year, if not 2-3 times a year, in my teaching. And there are other great textbooks out there, but it gives such a good narrative that doesn't skimp on depth. My students, if you read this, it's easy to get, it's not expensive. You don't only get a narrative sweep, which Professor Gerber does such a good job of, but she brings in the gems of literature and poetry and philosophy in nice sized chunks of primary sources, which again expose the student to what is history made of. It's made of going back to the sources. And she does that so well, and it's really an honor for me to introduce her today. And I'm really excited to hear about this new project. And I know we're all going to learn so much. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Drora. Thank you, ASF and its Institute of Jewish Experience, and Ronnie for your very, very generous introduction. Your series has provided wonderful access for us to meet a new generation of creative young scholars. And you've also emphasized not just the global reach of Sephardic Jewry, but helped us to dispel the widespread notion that Sephardic Jewry, which is one of the two main branches of the Jewish people, was somehow on the peripheries of Jewish history, on the margins, not in the center, when in fact, these younger scholars are beginning to emphasize for us how important in the creation of all of Jewish civilization the Sephardic experience has been. Today, and you'll bear with me, since this strange new medium of Zoom is not exactly native to me, I'd like to think aloud about the shaping of Sephardi history that went into my producing this book, and to share as well with you some of the places in which Sephardic civilization crystallized or matured. I'll raise a few questions that arose as I wrote the book and explain the factors that determined my choice of cities to study. I've been asked several times, so I'm a little defensive, why I omitted this city or that city. Wasn't it important? Was it not important? And as many of you know, Sephardim are very conscious, proudly and correctly so, of their origins or the origins of their ancestors. And there are many individual gems in the Sephardic mosaic that were not included. Having excused myself from the omissions, my choice of itinerary depended upon my definition of what is Sepharad, who is Sephardic, and more importantly, what locations and sources could illustrate this elusive goal without romanticizing the past or essentializing what is a very diverse group of talented people. I assumed the obvious, that some places were more critical in setting the parameters of Jewish life. I also assumed that being Sephardic meant to be connected to pre-1492 Spain in some fashion. I will go into that in a moment. Time permitting, as I share some of these issues and the cities, the choice of cities, I'll try to present a few slides to demonstrate how the sources beyond the conventionally accepted definition of historical text can shed light on our past. These visual, literary, or material sources include medieval illumination in the Haggadah that messages the Sephardic messianic stirrings in history, or a Dutch painting of the interior of the great synagogue, the great synagogue, Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam, in which we see the presence of a perfectly dressed, aristocratic Christian Dutch couple entering the precincts of Jewish worship, curious and ready to converse with Jews, not to convert the Jews. I was drawn as well to the stucco decorations interlacing one and the other on the synagogue walls in Toledo, because lo and behold, they matched the stucco interlacings of vegetal motifs in the Alhambra and in the Alcazar. And I wondered about the appearance and disappearance of a concentration of Jewish doctors in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, or the presence of a music academy and a mixed choir in the ghetto of Venice. Such data, when they were placed in a historic context, could supplement the chronicle, the rare memoir, and the rabbinic responsum. Along my path, I noted the intensity and often the fractious nature of Sephardic relations with one another and also with other Jews. I wasn't looking, and I emphasize this, for the so-called contributions of the Jews to a particular place. My goal was to try to understand how the Jews of Spain shaped and reshaped their collective life in different lands and eras, and how they adapted outside cultures and made them their own. I found it intriguing, that was my personal bias, that they remained fixated on a scintillating but ever receding memory of an Iberian past that in some ways was romanticized over and over with the passage of time. I begin my book, Cities of Splendour, in the shaping of Sephardi history, in the 10th century in Cordova, where Sepharad was born in a luxurious, cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, hurly-burly land of Berbers, Muslims, Jews. And I end in Amsterdam in the 17th century when newly fashioned Jews created a sober and dignified community out of a group of refugees fleeing the Inquisition who had been raised as Catholics in Portugal and were coming back, or not coming back, but were creating a new Jew out of a very tragic memory. 3 of the 7 cities I selected were under Christian rule, and 4 were under Muslim rule. There was no single prototype of where a Jew could dwell. It was up to the whims of local authorities, so some Jews lived in city walls, others along the banks of rivers, some in the shadow of a city's cathedral, rarely in the shadow of a mosque, since that was not permitted to them. The book is not meant as a travel guide in colorful cities in which they lived. That would have taken a multi-volume work because Sephardim have lived almost everywhere on the globe, forming a diaspora within the diaspora. The book is also not strictly chronological. The account concentrates on the 16th century, where there are overlapping developments in several centers. It also is not, and then I won't tell you any more of what it is not, but it is not an urban history, although the urban context is essential. I try to walk a fine line between the particular urban context and the overarching historic evolution of the Sephardic Jewish people. What sort of world did I encounter? One that was conspicuously multilingual. And even today, or maybe especially today, when you go into a Sephardic function, the multilingual nature, the multi-dimensional character of Sephardic Jewry it hits you right away. It is also multi-talented. It was frequently a colorful panorama of individual men and women. In fact, one of the characteristics of the Sephardic past is how individualistic it seemed long before the individualism of modern times. In other words, we have a lot of biographies or sketchy biographies of the few types of people. It was a world in which Jews vaunted their lineage and their ancient nobility. I will explain that in a moment as well. There was no one type of Sephardic Jew. We must really dispel that notion. They were sometimes defiantly aristocratic, at other times mystical and otherworldly. Some communities were quite practical, with more than their share of hard-nosed businessmen, while others were more otherworldly. Who is Svardic was the first question I needed to answer for myself, and one that is often asked today. Over the centuries, the term Sephardic was never static. Sephardim and Sepharad has broadened or narrowed, changed in definition from one century to another. The name Sepharad appears for the first and only time in the Bible as a specific place that possibly refers to a city in Asia Minor. It became identified as a Hebrew name for medieval Andalusia or Muslim Spain sometime in the 9th and 10th century. it seems to be clear that when Moses Maimonides, the great legal monument and luminary of medieval Spain, fled from Andalusia to Morocco and from Morocco to Egypt. And when he signed his name in Egypt in his letters as Moshe ben Maimon HaSfaradi, Moses ben Maimon the Sephardi, he had something specific in mind other than the piece of geography of Spain. I am using this restricted sense of Sephardim, referring to Jews who lived in Spain and their descendants, wherever they managed to get. In more recent decades, as we know, the label of Sephardic has often been applied, in some ways correctly, very broadly to include anyone who is not Ashkenazic, or more specifically, to the many Jews of Muslim lands, the Mizrahim, whether or not their ancestors were from Spain or descended directly from Spain. This broader definition recognizes the importance of the unifying culture of medieval Islam and of rabbinic Jewry that came out of Babel that the Jews shared since the Middle Ages. The expulsion of 1492 is a critical watershed, not just in this book, but because it is a critical watershed for understanding Sepharad. At that time, some Iberian Jews took one path going east, and some took a different path that led them to Portugal. We don't know how the decisions were made, probably based on convenience, on the how you could find a ship captain to get out, on chance, on luck. But eventually, those who went to Portugal become one of the two branches known as the Western Sephardim or the Nassau within this greater Sephardic world, and the torch of continuous Jewish identity and continuity went eastward via Italy to the Ottoman Empire, or southward to Morocco, Algeria, across North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, and become part of the continuity of Sepharad. From Portugal, that particular second branch of the Sephardic family was forcibly converted in 1497. And so the break begins in 1497 between the Western and the Eastern Sephardim, those who went openly as Jews into the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, did not have any break in the continuity of their familiarity with Judaism. They retained Hebrew. They generally retained some form of Spanish that then became translated into Ladino or Hakatia. They moved to the Balkans. They cherished the ballads, proverbs, and cuisine of Spain. Those who went to Portugal, who are in the last chapter of my book in Amsterdam, had a break and a rupture and a trauma that accompanied them in their diaspora experience. My book, both implicitly and explicitly then, is about a variety, but is also about what united these diasporas and separate communities. Each of the places I chose seemed to telescope some features of Sephardim. 10th century Cordova was the heartland and beginning, and I entitled that chapter Poetry and Politics in the Caliphate of Cordova. I tried to show the role of the Muslim court culture in shaping a Sephardic elite whose attitudes preoccupied Jewry and Sephardic Jewry for a long time. I looked at certain kinds of artifacts, the Hebrew poetry, which was in many ways a mirror of the Arabic secular and poetic literature that surrounded them. And I was struck by not just how elite this culture might have been, but how it percolated to the people, all the people, the Jewish people, that is, but how the Jews in Muslim Spain could balance Torah and Greek wisdom, science, and philosophy. The second chapter of my book focuses on Toledo, when Toledo was a Christian enclave and a meeting place and battleground. Muslim culture still surrounded the developing Christian culture, and Jews were in not just a frontier at the intersection of Christendom and Islam, but they were a cultural intermediary, especially as I tried to show in the court of Alfonso the Wise. I noted the growing triumphalism in the medieval Christian church that becomes an inspiration in some ways, or a subject, in other words, for the defiant, valiant, and muted response that Jews placed into their Haggadot of the Passover, in the illustrations and the illuminations that begin to appear in the art of the Jews of Christian Spain. Chapters 3 through chapter 7, meaning the bulk of the book, turns to the Sephardic diaspora after 1492. It concentrates on the diaspora within the diaspora. How did the Jews of Spain change? How did they continue to relate to their vision and past of romance and of Spain, with Spain? In chapter 3, I looked at the search for redemption at the city of Tzfat in the Galil, and the reverberations of the trauma of 1492 in the small town of mystics that were engaged in yearning for redemption. I tried to acknowledge the role of messianism and mysticism among Sephardic Jewry that is very prominent for centuries. Chapter 4, I returned to Europe, to the ghetto of Venice, where Jews of several origins interacted with one another, and Sephardic Jews from Spain and later from Portugal both seek in the 16th century institutional kinds of links that are then shared with other pioneering Jewries in Europe that are beginning to emerge in Europe. And I noted the role of Venice as a way station on the escape route of Sephardim out of Europe. In this context, I found a wonderful source providing a set of directives for an actual underground railway that Jews used to communicate and assist each other from Habsburg Antwerp, which was under the same rule or crown as Spain, to the independent city of Ferrara, where Jews could live, on to Venice, where they could find the ships either to go to the Venetian Empire or to go across to Dubrovnik and on a route to Salonika and Istanbul. This chapter ends with the Great Plague of 1630. I thought the Great Plague in some ways had many resonances with today, and with the call of Rabbi Luzzatto to the Venetian Senate to allow the Jews to remain in Venice because their networks of trade, their loyalty to place, would be useful to the economy of the city. Luzzatto's argument would be echoed verbatim later by the advocates for the admission or the naturalization of Jews in England and in some of the American colonies. I then turn to Istanbul and Salonika and the heart of the Sephardic diaspora in the Ottoman Empire. I struggled here, along with the rabbis of that era, to handle the diversity of their community, of Jews from Venice, of Jews from Sicily, of Jews kicked out of Provence, Jews kicked out of Germany, Jews kicked out of Hungary, and all of these together, Portuguese, all these 100 congregations in Istanbul who begin to emerge among the ancient and very interesting Greek Jews, or Romaniotes, who were the inhabitants of the city before the Sephardim appear. It took resilience. It took a good and numerous leadership, rabbinic leadership, lay leadership, female leadership, as well as male leadership. Female was not a rabbi, of course, and it took strong communal institutions to create a new Sepharad, and it took the new art of printing that had been brought directly from Spain with the inception of printing in 1493 in Istanbul, little later in Salonika, little later than that in Egypt. But all of these several factors enabled a civilization, and along with the cement of the Ladino language, to restore, retrieve, and recreate a new Sephardic entity. My final chapter focused on the Portuguese Jews of the Western Sephardi diaspora in Amsterdam. I entitled it Jewish Life in Amsterdam and the Formation of the Western Sephardi Diaspora. I was curious how the secret Jews of Portugal became the new Jews of Western Europe. How does one build community when there were no prior education, no prior experience of living Jewishly? And I had an ambitious agenda here that was new to me as well. I was able, I hope, to convey some of the forces that differentiated these many Sephardic Jewries who were at home in the cultures of their adopted lands, who filled many different roles as artisans, as merchants, as bankers, and even as beggars, who retained links with far-flung families as far as Goa, as far as the Caribbean, and still the family links continued, and who preserved a pride until today in their great achievements they had attained in Spain. What I'd like to do is look with you now at a few of the slides that will illustrate some of the tendencies that I speak about, but perhaps with the pictures might be more graphic and compelling than all the words. So if we turn, and here I'm going to try to coordinate with my limited computer skills. So let's see how we can turn to the slides.
Well, I have it open already. I put up
okay. Well, there.
I put up just the front cover of your book first.
Yes, let me first, and I'll make a plug for the Littman Library and the Liverpool University Press, who were very patient and bore with me while I struggled to decide on which communities I would not write about, which I would write about, and had to justify that to different Sephardic friends along the way. The first slide gives us the first two slides depict from medieval times what might appear on first glance to be somewhat exotic, somewhat frivolous, somewhat beautifully medieval. You can see in the picture a man on the right with a very distinctive cap. It's not a yarmulke, but it is a Jewish cap required. It is a distinctive Jewish outfit required of Jews beginning in the 13th century in Toledo. Yet he's playing a game of chance, game of dice, with a group of nobles. The architecture that is outlined here is a very typical kind of Arab-inspired architecture, Mudeha architecture of Christian Toledo, which shares the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish presence in one city. So the synergy of Toledo appears in this Christian manuscript with the visible presence of the Jew. The second of the pair in this, and then I'll tell you a little just about this manuscript tradition. The second slide gives us a sense of the medieval, of the introduction by the Muslims of the Christian manuscript tradition, in which we learn about many ancient, innovative, recreational, medical, and other works that appear in medieval Spain, particularly in that multicultural city of Toledo. Here, the Jew appears in a much more stereotypic form. He has already, although this is not an anti-Jewish work, this book about chess, he has this stereotypic outline and profile of the Jew. He is wearing the distinctive Jewish headgear that was required of Jews beginning around this time. And the other people in back of him seem to be in a kind of subversive whispering or consulting fashion, hovering a little, but also not cringing, but their body language is different from the nobles who are playing chess together. We move on from the second picture to number 3. We see again some of the beautiful art created by Jews, the manuscripts of medieval Spain that begin to appear in the 13th, 14th century in Spain. If we look very closely at this abstract design, we see a very unusual phenomenon, and that is that the design itself, the lettering itself, is a calligraphy of Hebrew characters that is very characteristic of the medieval art, the artistic emphasis in Sephardic Jewry until today is something noted and notable within the community itself. But there was, if we turn now, draw to the next slide, there was as well time and the circumstances by the 14th century in which the Jews were functioning was a difficult century. Messages of hope, messages of redemption, messages of return, and of pride in Jewish traditions begin to permeate some of the artwork in the illuminated Hebrew manuscript. These are the Haggadah, or the Haggadah of Passover, is one of the favorite places in which you could select these messages, which are both messianic and perhaps also a little subversive. So I try to suggest using these illuminations of what Jews might have been thinking as they sat around the table together at Passover in the privacy of their home and hearth. And let's turn to the next message in the next manuscript. This again, from the Passover Haggadah, is a motif that has been discussed by art historians of how the Matzah and the symbol of the Matzah of redemption becomes part of those illuminations. We can see here we're talking about Christian Spain and the putti, the embellishment on the illuminations on the manuscript, heralding Messianic era in the Pesach fervor, adorn the art of the Jews of Spain. Adornment, art, aesthetics have been until today an abiding part of the Sephardic tradition. We move on from there to a cluster of 4 different slides. The first of which is a very well-known slide, a very well-known monument, perhaps the most well-known of Spain, the Alhambra Palace, the Muslim structure within the Iberian Peninsula. And the next slide, I try to have them together. It's a little harder for me to do it this way because it's a cluster of 4 slides. The first was the Alhambra. This one is I believe they're also similar. That when I have them together, you really wouldn't know which is the Christian palace, which is the Muslim palace, and we'll turn to the next 2. Those we'll see. But we look again. This one is the Aron HaKodesh of the synagogue. Again, the same motif of the El Tránsito synagogue in Toledo, and the last of this cluster, again, is from the synagogue with its adornment. And if we look very closely, we'll see under this wonderful Hebrew lettering is Arabic calligraphy in the synagogue. So the motifs, the vegetal motifs that appear in these are in fact the fact that the four interacting, the three monuments in these four slides give us a sense of the Sephardic Jew, not just in Iberia, but the Sephardic Jew who carries within his tradition that makes him different, the fact that he lived in a tripartite culture for many centuries and responded and then moved back from Spain and Portugal when expelled to the diaspora throughout the world. Who is Sephardic then, and what made the Sephardim distinctive? The sole branch of the Jewish people to be identified specifically with a country was what intrigued me in this journey through these cities of splendor. So I'd like to turn now for the questions that you might have. The last picture, just to show you the opulence of that Sephardic diaspora. There are two others. Thanks for putting it on. This is the one. The picture before this was the Spanish synagogue in the ghetto of Venice. It is one of the few synagogues that is still open, that you can have the pleasure of having a Shabbat in this, not at all times of the year, in this beautiful, beautiful, opulent synagogue. And finally, the synagogue of the Sephardic, the very dignified Sephardic Jews, Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, who become the Aron of that synagogue. If you look at the Aron HaKodesh, the ark in the back, for those of us in New York, it's quite similar to the Aron HaKodesh in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York, which in turn also is shared by the same kind of Aron HaKodesh in the Bevis Mark synagogue in London. So the Western Sephardic diaspora has its roots in Portugal, in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain, and as we know, in New York, its continuity, and in all the diaspora today. So let me turn to you now, or do you want to chair this, Ronnie, or Dora, or?
So first, thank you.
Thank you.
Every time I hear you, I definitely learn something new. So I'm going to start with, first of all, you had so many thank yous. So let's start with some questions, if you don't mind. Hi, I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I have heard recently that the golden era of Spain is a myth. Is this true?
The golden era was not a myth. People just don't know what it was. The golden era was a golden moment. And it's been telescoped into saying 500 years of glory, when in fact what in Jewish history we're really referring to is a moment in which Jews began to sing in beautiful biblical Hebrew. And they didn't sing about I shouldn't say just about God. They didn't sing only about God, but they sang about God, about nature, about life, about the mysteries of life in beautiful biblical Hebrew, and their longing as well for Jerusalem and Zion. So the golden age in which this occurs against a background that was where there was very fleeting tolerance, but tolerance that was limited at the same time. So the myth is that everything was wonderful among the people, but the gold was of the cultural artifacts that they created. And that was, in fact, real.
Thank you. Are you okay to answer a few more?
Sure.
Okay. So the question is, how did the name Sfarad become attached to Spain, which I also have this question always, attached to Spain when it referred to a place in Asia Minor in the Bible?
Thank you. Okay.
Great question.
This is conjecture. In the book of Obadiah, they talk about Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad. It's not just the exiles of Jerusalem. And it wasn't just any exiles of Jerusalem who were dispersed. It was the exiles of Jerusalem who were the aristocrats. This was the way that the Spanish Jews, Sepharad sounded like Hispania. Sepharad might have been derived. It's not clear which is the before and the after. But in the 9th century, when we begin to talk about Sepharad, the biblical association with aristocratic exiles of Jerusalem was not only intriguing, it was compelling. If you think a lot of yourself, what better yichus to have? What better kinds of honor than to be related? All Jews are related as kind of to each other, but to be related to the aristocracy of Jerusalem was just too tempting. You had to take that as your kind of your origin. So Sepharad, by the 10th century, 9th century, 10th century, it sounded like Hispania, probably to the people. It was associated with Spain.
Okay. We're going to move over to Amsterdam for a moment, if you don't mind. The question is
one thing to that question. There's one tiny link along the way that helped, which was that Targum Onkelos translates it as Aspamia. So already, why he did that, that's, that is definitely.
It was earlier. It's unclear what Onkelos, what was meant by it at that point. But
Right.
Right, and which came first. Okay, so if we move over to Amsterdam, the question is, you mentioned how through no fault of their own, the Sephardim arriving in Amsterdam were ignorant about Judaism. How did this change? Who trained the Sephardic rabbis of Amsterdam in the 16th century? And were they trained in some type of blended Jewish religious tradition or in a purely Sephardic tradition?
It's a wonderful and an intriguing question of how you become Jews. These were not Jews. They had been Catholic and had learned, we don't know, because they were secret Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. We don't know. They did a good job of hiding. The Inquisition that was trying to ferret them out was looking for signs of Jewishness, but the Jews themselves were learning at some point from visitors to Iberia or from being enrolled in the theological faculties in the most exciting Spanish universities that were flowering at that time. They were returning after 1580 when Spain and Portugal were united. Jews had new links with each other in the Iberian Peninsula. They began to move back and forth a little. We know as well that they learned that the Jews were the former Jews, the new Christians, had some kinds of contacts with each other, and visitors who came, some Jews came openly as diplomats to the courts from Morocco to serve in the courts representing Moroccan kings, bringing with them probably the same way as my generation brought books to Soviet Jews. These representatives who were themselves Sephardic Jews who had fled to Morocco, brought back knowledge to Spain, coming from Italy, coming from Tunis, coming from elsewhere, as tradesmen as well as diplomats. We know that the type of Judaism, it's different learning from your parents and a community. Learning about something from a book or by choice creates another kind of identity. And the Western Sephardim, in the atmosphere, the Protestant atmosphere of Holland, became different Jews or a different diaspora, Sephardic nonetheless, and Sephardic in its passions as it returned, not in all cases, but in some. And they learned from autodidacts or very important teachers who came from the Ottoman Empire, who came from Morocco, who came from Italy. They brought books with them to literally teach the new Jews of Amsterdam. These new Jews had a wonderful school, the Etz Chaim Yeshiva, with very high standards and very good teachers. So it was a combination of passion, some sort of constant underground learning, self-learning, and maybe that is also why Sephardic Jewry is such an attractive kind of prototype to many modern contemporary Jews. The new Jew, the Jew by choice, also can find this paradigm of an experience in Sephardic history.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Professor Gerber. This was absolutely wonderful. I know I learned a lot, as usual. So.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming, and have a great day and a great evening. Thank you once again. And
we would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.